So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here for the Demystifying AI Ethics Roundtable today. For those of you who haven't been to a live event before, I'm Sarah Benoit with the JV Media Institute, and I've been hosting these every month, and we've been talking about a different sort of subject focus, and we'll be doing that all the way through December, and sort of tackling different areas of discussion. And a lot of this has really been so that we can just share information and resources and thoughts about where we're at, how we're handling things for ourselves personally, how we're handling things if we're in a leadership position with a business or organization. And just to be clear, there's no like right or wrong at this point in the game, right? So I think everything is up for discussion. Every opinion should be allowed to be given, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, as far as how comfortable or uncomfortable you are with AI. And I think that's where, like I said, when we get to the discussion questions, I'd love to hear from all of you, just any thoughts or feedback that you have. I did put together, as usual, a little presentation, like I said, where I just share some thoughts and resources and things that are kind of action steps for later on. Again, we're going to do these every single month, so we have one next month as well. And so if you signed up for all of those, I'll be sending out a reminder about that, and along with the recording of this in the next few days. And also with these recordings, I really encourage people, if there's other folks that work in your organization or just are your friends, or people who are asking these questions, feel free to just send the video links to them and ask them to engage. Because from my perspective, the number one thing I want is just for the conversations to be happening. And hey, welcome, Candace. Thanks for being here. I just think we have to talk about this stuff. I think a lot of times we are kind of launching technology and all diving into it and adopting it before we really ask any questions about it. And I think with social media, for many of you who know me, I'm a longtime social media expert. I think social media is just a prime example of where we really made some bad choices around this. We didn't ask enough questions first. We just were like, hey, everybody, put this in your pocket. And like 10 or 15 years later, we're like, wait a second, there's some things that we needed to work out about this. And so I just think we have to continue having those conversations and think about how we implement things. So today's topic was privacy and security, and hopefully everybody can see my shared screen. If you can't, let me know in the chat. And again, feel free to jump in anytime in this conversation in the chat, or just unmute and hop in. But the first thing I wanted us to share, if we can just share, like I said, sort of roundtable, since there's a small group of us today. Before we dig into AI and what's going on with AI and privacy and security, how do you all feel about privacy and security in general right now? Like the internet, your data. Does anybody have strong opinions about this, or have you had experiences with this? Or, like before, AI is going to bring something sort of new into the conversation, and we're going to talk about what that is. But I think we all have our own experiences at this point.
Yeah, I can just share that, like, phishing emails. I work in IT, so like phishing emails have been increasingly more sophisticated, less typos. They're obviously utilizing some sort of Gen AI stuff to generate a lot of this material. So it's been kind of scary, actually, some of the things that they've been able to do.
Yeah, I'll throw in, as a social media person, we've been seeing so much of that, especially on Facebook, where people are sending you random links or trying to like fear monger you into responding to something. And it's like, I have to be really vigilant in reminding people. I'm like, don't emotionally react and click on anything just because, like, let's look at it first, and really trying to identify what are like real communications, whether it's by email or messenger, versus how do I identify something that's not a legitimate communication. It's actually, like you said, it's getting so much more sophisticated. You really have to have an eye for it. Anybody else just have thoughts on privacy and security and how you feel about it, or experiences you've had in that world?
Well, I feel like it's going to get easier and easier for our personal data to just kind of be out there, and easier for using AI to grab it. That's not going to be someone digging for it. It's just going to be a super simple search. Where can I find this information, and how can I get it?
Yeah, and I will say, especially when we've kind of like we're in like a legal limbo with lots of things, especially in the United States, especially because we're in an election year. It's like we can't really like do any actual action from a policy standpoint because of where we're at, and so it just leaves like a lot of things hanging out there. I feel, you know. Anybody else, feel free to chat in too if you don't want to unmute. Just want to give everybody a chance to share. I will say, one thing from my perspective, so I don't have kids and I've been online for a long time for a career. And so, I'm very aware that like my sort of looseness around my data is like not the same for everybody, right? So like I'm one of those people who sometimes, because I'm a marketer, because it's my job, I'll have an app ask me like, can I track you? And I'm like, oh yeah, sure. Go ahead, see what I'm doing. Crunch that data and pass it along, right? And I have different feelings about different brands in that way. I'm more comfortable with some than others. Sometimes I'm not sure there's like a real reason I'm more comfortable or uncomfortable, other than like I'm just connected to a brand more than I am another brand. Um, and so it's just interesting because I feel like we all, in our businesses, there's other concerns because we have to think about the data of our customers, our clients, our donors, whoever it is that we're working with. But I think it's interesting, like, how close or far away we are about that, like in our personal lives. So like I feel like at work, I'm much more thoughtful because of the sensitive information that I contain about my clients. I'm much more thoughtful about what I'm doing with that data. My personal data, I kind of just throw around the internet. I'm like, I already sold my soul. Like I've been online for too long, and it's just like all my stuff is out there. And at the same time, then I have little quirks, right? Like I don't like, I've never taken a picture of a check. I don't know. I'm weird about it. I just don't do it. I'm very thoughtful about online banking. Like I don't like having the app on my phone. I sometimes added it when I need it, but I don't want it to remember any of my passwords. Like I have all these like little tricks and stuff. Does anybody else kind of have those like gut feelings, or are you doing a lot of research to say like this is where I trust and where I don't? I'm just curious.
It's kind of funny because I'm kind of like the opposite of that. Like I like mostly just use apps for like my banking and like stuff like that. But then when it comes to like sharing personal data, I like opt out of pretty much everything. And like I don't know why I feel that way about banking because there's risks either way. But I'm kind of like sometimes like doing this stuff over the phone and in person feels like more insecure sometimes because of the way that some of that data goes. But yeah, I don't know. It's yeah, it does seem kind of like whatever you choose to feel comfortable with. There's not like a set, right and wrong or best practice really even.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hey, Candace, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it was, and I'm sorry, guys, because I'm driving and I just cannot seem to get to a place to stop. So, yeah. So, to be honest with you, I'm totally confused about on this whole topic of privacy and security. I mean, there's some basics that, of course, I get, but it just seems like I think, as someone said earlier, things are getting a lot more sophisticated, and then trying to understand how to protect yourself versus not. For the first time ever in my entire life, I had my credit card compromised, just trying to make a transaction to purchase online. And, thank goodness the banking company somehow recognized that something was wrong and declined it. And they were the ones that called me. But I was completely oblivious to it. It looked completely legit. I mean, it's like you can't do shopping online anymore. So I'm confused about what protections do you really have, even when you think you're doing things to protect yourself. Are you really protected? All the applications that you can add on, all of the changing of security, saying don't track me, is it really honored?
Yeah. Yeah, and I really appreciate you adding to that because I feel like that really strengthens what Alex was saying and what I think is really important for us to acknowledge in this conversation as we start to talk about AI. We're already kind of in a very weird spot at this point. Like there is no standard. There is no real agreed upon approach. You see places like the European Union starting to develop this more in their policy conversations and really say, Your personal data is a human right. You have the ability, like these are like really important principles that sort of like lay the groundwork for what you're talking about, Candace, right? Like it's what lays the groundwork for us to say, this is what we should expect. This is what the rules are. This is what the law says. And we're really not there. So we're kind of like living in this very gray world, especially in the United States, I feel, because we give a lot of power to corporate business, and corporate business right now, it benefits them to have as much access to our data as possible. So they've been pushing back for a long time, and they are lobbying and they are funding political candidates and doing all of those different things that are going to go into affecting whether or not we can sort of create that foundation or that baseline. So I think that's just one of the key things that from the beginning of this conversation is hard, because we haven't necessarily answered these questions yet in a generalized sense. And it's really evolved over 20 years, like the risk levels, the sophistication of things, all of that has changed before we even started saying like AI, AI, AI. All of that stuff was already adapting. And now we're going to integrate something that is really going to amplify this conversation. And that's why I think we have to sort of be in a place where we know, okay, a lot of how I feel is emotional or based on my anecdotal experience. There's not really this like kind of agreed upon approach that we can take where we all say this is what safe means on the internet. And I do think as we have generations of more digital natives, this is going to be a bigger and bigger conversation, right? Because now we have almost 2 generations of people that are growing up where this is like their baseline of how they exist in the world. And I just think it's going to be interesting to see what they say as they become, more of them become adults. Like, how do they feel about this? Is their perspective different than, let's say, my generation, which is the Gen Xers? I just feel like there's like this whole sort of world where we have to have conversations and we have to know that there's not necessarily an answer yet. It's more of like culturally and legally, and even I think industry by industry, we're going to be making decisions about this. So if we want to take leadership, how do we do that? The biggest problem with AI is really that the AI systems, like I said, they're just amplifying the privacy risks and the security risks that we already have. So we've been having these problems since the internet came about. As technology advances, the problems become different problems. They're sort of all based in the same issue, but like the complexity of those things become, I think, bigger and bigger as we've moved forward. And I think especially across the world, obviously it's true everywhere, but especially in the United States, the issue of commercialization and business profit being really associated with data, I think creates like a much bigger question. So if you watch like The Social Dilemma, that's one of the first conversations I really tell people if they want to start to understand where the AI discussions are going. That's a great place to start, again, because I see social media as a really key component of the AI conversation, because that's where we implemented AI, we put it in everybody's pockets, we made them interact with it every day, and then we literally sold their data to people. And it's not even just like big tech and social media companies are alone. Social media companies work with our banks, our debit card providers, our credit card providers, and they exchange data about us, right? And so like they correlate my Facebook profile to my debit card account. And that allows them to see a lot of information about what I buy, when I buy it, everything, in addition to all this like personal information I'm sharing. So what we're seeing is kind of like that's already been in question for a long time, and AI is really going to amplify the conversation, and especially now because it's getting integrated into all these different places. So something like ChatGPT is now being integrated into all these other platforms. So it's connecting in to all the data that's on those platforms in different ways. So there's 3 main areas that I think AI, we really have these bigger sort of complex issues that we have to think about. So a lot of times people will say, oh, AI, it's not that big of a deal. It's just the next level of what we were doing before. And that is true to a certain extent. But I think when we talk about how hungry AI is for data, I think a lot of people just don't realize that for artificial intelligence to do what it's doing, it needs millions upon millions upon millions of data points to really function, right? And do these magical things that we think it can do. So it's really data hungry. It requires a lot of information that has been collected to be put into the systems so that they work. And this is kind of true if you're familiar with like Google Analytics, right? There's certain parts of Google Analytics, or even if you're doing meta advertising, there's certain parts of those tools where if you don't have enough data, they don't function. right? I can't build a custom audience if I don't have a big enough list or I don't have enough website traffic, right? We can't trigger the AI inside those systems to function unless we're going to feed it enough data. So that's like one of the biggest things that we're immediately sort of talking about. Okay, like, yes, this is the same as before. It's some of the same problems and issues, but now we're talking about a lot of pieces of information about people. And so what do we think about that, right? Because in some ways, this is just increasing the amount of surveillance that we already have happening and the amount of tracking we already have happening, right? We're going to need to track more minutia and data points and, you know, information about people to sort of feed these systems what they need. Of course, like the number one place where we're starting this conversation is around identity theft and extortion. So we're already having these situations where AI systems are being used to mimic a person's voice, mimic a person in video, mimic a person on the phone, and really create like a situation where they are scaring somebody into extorting them. There's actually been a number of families that have gone through this that have now gone to Congress and testified to say, like, we have to have laws about this. We don't even have a way to prosecute these people when they do this to us, right? Because what they're doing doesn't really fit in to how it's been done before. So that sort of identity theft and fraud is kind of the first like level of risk. And I think a lot of people, again, we've already experienced these things. So what we're afraid of is AI is going to amplify that at a much bigger level. And, you know, you made the point, I think, Rachel, like, AI tools are being trained to go and get this stuff all over the internet about people. And if hackers can hack into systems and then deploy their AI to collect the data faster than it's ever been collected before, right? Like it's sort of like superpowering their efforts to actually take real information about people that can be damaging to them financially and economically. And then I think related to that is kind of this bigger question again, which we've been talking about for quite a few years in a general sense, but now is becoming like much more concerning, which is, you know, when we're posting on social media, when we're in our email on Gmail, when we're using MailChimp, when we're using Canva, when we're doing all these different things online, using business tools, especially for our companies and organizations. And those things are tapped into OpenAI's ChatGPT system, right? Or they're tapped into Google Gemini in some way. What is the process for consenting to what part of my information gets integrated into that and then is used to train AI, right? So like this comes down to how are we going to, again, as a society, kind of define when do I get to have a voice in saying, hey, don't train the AI on this. A good example of this would be, so we have a Slack channel with a team that I work with. We share a lot of ideas and information there about clients. And Slack recently came to us and said, we're going to implement our AI. And we want you to be aware that it's going to be training off of you. And, you know, you can opt out. And it was funny. They were like, you can opt out by calling us, right? So I couldn't send an email and opt out. I was going to have to get on the phone and talk to somebody about opting out. But I had to say to the team, how do we feel about that? Because I don't understand what they mean by training with our data. Like if we're sharing our top marketing ideas for our clients in here, like where is that going, right? Like what do we mean by training? What are they learning from us? How are they going to then implement that to other people using Slack, which is millions of other businesses, right? And organizations. And because of that lack of clarity, I wanted us to really ask the question if we want to call Slack and say, no, we don't want you training your AI off of what we're doing. And it's an interesting question because we all had different opinions about it, right? So it's this sort of idea of knowledge, consent, how do those systems work? When does a company have to ask you? Shouldn't it be easier to opt out than to have to do all these extra steps? Like, shouldn't you be able to, I feel like, shouldn't it be a setting where I toggle that on and off in our Slack settings, right? And the reason that this is so important, again, is there's some real life examples like the ones here where facial recognition that's being used to apprehend people that have committed crimes. There's a bunch of false arrests of Black men, right? Because they're being misidentified by the AI because there's bias built into it, right? Or even Amazon built its own AI to do its hiring. So it was basically the AI was going to go in, look at all the stuff, decide who should get an interview and who shouldn't. And they realized they're just totally writing women out of the picture because the AI has got this bias built in. So again, it's like this we sort of think of these things sometimes, I think, outside of the real world issues it can have, right? Once AI is deployed to actually make real life decisions about things. And so if we're going to train it on data, what does that mean? What kind of data? How diverse is the data, right? Does anybody know of any positive ways that AI supports privacy and security? Because there are some really big arguments for why it's going to help us. I'm curious if any of y'all have delved into that.
Because as a general rule, when I use Google, I am on many different machines. And I think there is a big benefit to the intelligence knowing, hey, Mark, you're stepping out of bounds of your normal use of your Google account. And as a result, I see proactive steps to validate, is this really Mark?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically able to detect like, hey, so the person using your account isn't behaving like you right now. And that might actually be a good thing if somebody's actually hacked in. Absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, from what I understand, there are more tools being created to utilize AI for security purposes. So like, yeah, kind of like Mark is saying, like scan environments to detect for abnormal stuff that's going on. So, but it's kind of interesting, the two forces working on both. It's like AI fighting AI at a certain point, which is kind of interesting. But
Yeah, that's where I get
Alex's,
really sci-fi about it.
to Alex's point too, it's we live in a world where people expect convenience, and there is a threshold of being too convenient relative to privacy and security to making it easy for how we interact online. Specifically, what comes to mind is the Google Passkey, not understanding the qualifications of what happens when you use a passkey relative to traditional password and second factor authentication.
Yeah, I will say I often, I've gotten a lot of stuff on my Apple devices where it scans my face for different things, which I travel a lot and I teach and speak a lot. And so sometimes I'm glad that there's just, I don't know, like if I leave my stuff anywhere, it's going to require certain things, but it's a really imperfect system. And, in some ways I've realized like I'm a white person and I'm lucky that it's working as well as it's working, right? If you look at the studies, it's really not working as well for people of color, for sure, when it comes to facial recognition. So there's like this strength in, again, convenience for me. I'm not typing a password all the time. I'm looking at my computer or my phone. It's just like bringing up what I need. It knows it's me, right? But at the same time, there's been moments where I'm at a different angle or, whatever, and it's not working. And it's like, I'm really glad that I can still tap my Apple phone and say, I need to use my password to get in here, right? Because it isn't 100% perfect. It's not always, the AI is not always on its game.
yeah, I feel like to that point, like, all of these things are only as good as the data that it's fed. And, in my experience, it is really not that good, even, in most situations. I would say, like, to have clean data outside of like a scientific realm, it's rare.
Yeah, and I was just listening to an amazing tourism expert who runs an AI company, and she said the exact same thing. She said AI is only as powerful as the data that is underlying it. And I was like, ooh, girl, that is really so well said. And we need to mantra that as many places as possible because it's really true. Like the quality of the data, the more clarity we have around what we consider important data, personal data, what the rules are about it, the more that we lay that groundwork, the better we're going to be at deploying AI, I feel. It's really important to understand the relationship between those things, right? Because again, we've had AI, we've released AI into the internet and watched it become a really cruel, terrible being, right? When it's fed all sorts of just random human things. And so we have to really like realize it's just not as simple as saying like, well, we can just train it to do the good stuff. It doesn't really work like that at the end, right? There's like, that's where when we say that AI can hallucinate, I'm like, we can't just deploy it everywhere when we know it's hallucinating. Like I'm using it pretty much every day and I can see where sometimes it just goes off the rails entirely, right? And like, I mean, I find it entertaining on one level, but I find it scary when I think about the fact that, I don't know, we're implementing it into all sorts of like wartime computer systems and we're implementing it into all sorts of things that will directly affect somebody's everyday life. When I just traveled to Italy, I didn't even have to show my passport to a person. I showed my passport to a scanner and then I looked at a camera and it confirmed it was me, right? Going in and out of Italy. So, I mean, that's great as long as it works 100% of the time, right? And it doesn't do anything wrong in that position. Otherwise, it's going to potentially do something wrong and really like set off a whole problem for people when, you know, it might just be that, again, it hasn't been fully trained and, you know, in the way that it needs to be to effectively process every single person that would walk through that gate. And I just found that fascinating that like we have countries where that's how you're allowed in and out, right? There's no person double checking that. It was just the camera and me and the scanner. And it was like 2 stations. So I had to scan my passport, make sure that was all correct, and then step up to a camera, make sure that I faced it correctly. It would scan my face and then it would tell me I could enter. So we're going to see more of that. So I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that I do think AI can help because I do feel like this is a double-edged sword. And again, we have to be having the conversations about what does it mean when AI is doing the right thing versus the wrong thing when it comes to privacy and security. There is a concept called privacy by design, which is really about how, you know, I think of it sort of like human-centered design. It's really about how if we're going to design systems and platforms and structures to how we're doing things, that privacy measures should be sort of integrated from the very beginning of the stage. Like, you know, we shouldn't be like creating everything and then having privacy as a thought after the fact once the system is built. I think that's an incredibly important part for the technologists that actually build AI technology, that we make privacy the initial thought, part of the foundation of what they do. And it's really about minimizing data collection and really defining clearly what's strictly necessary, what needs to be secured, and then really giving people an easy way to say, I don't want to share my information, right? So it's kind of those 3 key factors that they want to build in to our approach to things.
And Sarah, are you going to the AI event at the Collider on Friday?
I am not.
And with that year that you just mentioned, I'm not sure how to effectively hear, you know, in that group meeting, how to monitor and advocate for the privacy, security, sensitivity from the technical attribute.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think like privacy by design is kind of a movement right now, you know, which I think is like an easy thing to identify and talk about and say, you know, this is about like how we develop the technology, not just how we integrate the technology after it exists, but how are we actually building it from scratch and being able to ask companies what level of this was put into their thought process. So when I'm like looking at which companies I want to pay and which AI tools I want to give money to, because I'm like fueling their success when I'm doing that, I will say that this is something that I ask questions about before I make a purchase, right? And if they can't answer the question or there's no person for me to talk to, I'm moving on to a different tool because I'm really going to focus on transparency with the things that I spend and invest my money in right now as a company. And that's really important to me that you're either talking about it very clearly on your website, you're willing to answer those questions in your FAQs, you know, that stuff is upfront. And when you're not upfront about it, yeah, I'm curious as to why. And I mean, this is about our very first session on transparency, and accessibility and really understanding why those core principles are part of the AI discussion as well. Like, because there's sort of a black box, glass box approach, right? Like the AI companies that are willing to really talk about what they're doing, really show it, really be transparent about it, really talk about their process. And some of the companies are like, who cares? It's just awesome. Move on, you know? And it's like, I'm really not investing in those companies because I don't appreciate that approach. I just think that's really short-sighted. It's not a long game, you know? And so that's where I think some of us can, in leadership, again, have options to sort of say, like, are these principles and mindsets that were built into the approach? So that's just some ideas of how I'm kind of, trying to have those conversations or ask these questions when I'm in different events and different meetings. The other kind of things that we see with AI that are potential sort of solutions are these sort of 4 areas. So federated learning, differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, and blockchain for data privacy. So I know this is really technical for a lot of us. We're like, what does this mean? These are just really, again, sort of core approaches to AI systems where we're really like training them, like federated learning, training them from decentralized data sources, right? So we're not transferring data from other places, like really thinking about the larger data ecosystem, right? And I think that is going to require some level of collaboration from AI companies, especially the larger ones. It's going to require some level of standardization and policy. We're not quite there yet. But just really thinking about how we can take the data we have and protect people. Again, these are all sort of different levels of privacy and security, from training to how we present the data sets to how we encrypt different things. And so again, it sort of goes into like the very IT aspect of these things and the really deeper level of how we build systems. But I think, again, if you can even be aware that like these are kind of areas where if an AI company is focused on some of this, talking about some of this, right, sharing some of how they're applying these approaches to things, that this means they are putting a more depthful thought into what they're doing, right? And they're putting privacy and security as a higher priority on their list, right? And again, every company is different because it depends on their goals, their values as a brand. And that's why I really encourage people, before you say yes to a tool or just implement a tool, that you sort of ask some questions about it and, make sure that you feel comfortable with it. And some things, again, you're going to find they don't even know the answers yet. Like Canva, which I'm using every day, which I appreciate very much so. And I love their AI tools. I feel more comfortable with that tool because I'm not actually uploading any data to it, right? I'm not sharing anything about my customers with Canva. I'm just making graphics and editing photos. Cool. That's a different realm than, let's say, if I'm using something like Jasper, right? Where I'm actually putting lots of information about my clients, their audiences, their markets, their brand voice, right? I'm actually like taking a bunch of information about their company and implementing it, all the way up to any tool where I would, let's say, upload my emails, upload stuff from my CRM. It's like, if I'm going to do that level, like now I'm at a whole other where I might be uploading people's addresses and their phone numbers, or if AI is implemented into my customer relationship management tool, right? Like Salesforce has put a lot of different AI into their system, but they're also being very transparent in a lot of ways about how they're dealing with that. Adobe is very similar, another company that I feel like is really working hard on a transparency level. What are they doing with people's stock photos? What are they doing with the graphics that you design? How protected are you as an artist, right? They're actually talking very clearly about that because their core audience is worried about it. So just kind of understanding, even if you don't understand the in-depth part of this, what are some of the ways that AI is actually can be set up to protect us rather than hurt us? And then there's a few things that we can actually do, right? So we can regularly review, and this is a lot of individual stuff, but I think it also goes to any of us in business and how we're applying things in business. But I think really doing regular audits or reviews of your online accounts, understanding, personally and professionally, what's on social media, what are you putting out there, what information have you shared, is there anything that you don't feel comfortable having out there? Do you want to remove that? I know that takes time, and that's something a lot of people are like, I don't have time for this. I'm like, I know, but even if you took like a half an hour once a month and reviewed some things and just made sure you feel comfortable with everything that's out there, I think is valuable. I think anytime somebody is asking for personal information, I would even throw in that I'm very thoughtful about things like TikTok, where all these games are like, we're going to scan your face or your hands, right? And I'm like, I don't know about that right now. What are you doing with that? That's my fingerprints, right? That's like the thing you need to hack into my phone, right? To hack into something else. So I'm really thoughtful about like these third-party things that are pinging me for all sorts of scannable stuff, right? Not just like my phone number, my name, my social security, like that personal data, but even just like me as an individual. I'm really thoughtful about not just doing that with random things. looking at your privacy settings. So as a social media professional, this is something I really talk to a lot of people about. Really go in there and see what the privacy settings say. They change all the time, right? So the privacy settings inside of Meta or Pinterest or LinkedIn, the different things that are inside of things like MailChimp, all that sort of stuff. You'll notice inside your settings, there's often updates to what they're doing. They don't always have any legal reason to message you and tell you to look at them and tell you to be aware of them. So I'm telling people like once a year, make sure you're like revisiting the main platforms that you use. Is there anything that's changed? I know we get a lot of emails where they'll say our privacy and security policy is updated. Most of us just delete that and don't read it. I'm like, now would be the time to read it, for sure. And then if you're doing things like, if you're hosting your website, hosting an app, doing different things like that, really looking at, what is your hosting setup? What is your server security? Some small businesses, we don't have very much because we're paying very little for our hosting space, right? And it's on a shared server. Other companies have much more privatized servers. If you're going to be keeping a lot of customer information anywhere, whether that's on your website or maybe it's in a piece of software, it's important to understand like how that stuff is hosted on the internet and what level of protection you have. So just asking those questions, right? Some of us don't have IT people. And so we have to like go and figure out how to ask those questions. But especially if you work with IT folks, I mean, I think, people like you, Alex, are usually way more up to date about the changes because that's like part of what you're doing. So, if you have those people on your team, ask them those questions. And then a lot of us are already aware of things like GDPR and CCPA. These are the different laws and policies that are coming out about data protection. European Union, California especially have led the way on this. And like, what are people's rights? When can they access or ask you to delete their data? And really understanding like how to report things. A lot of people don't realize that, like for me as a web designer, even though I'm a very small business, I have huge amounts of information from my clients, their passwords to all sorts of things, to their PayPal, to, lots of different stuff. I really have to know when I keep that stuff, where I'm keeping those type of logins. I have them double encrypted in a secure platform, right? And for me, that was really important because it's like, if I ever get hacked and I've got all that stuff in my Gmail or on my computer, right? I have documents of people's passwords. Like I'm really creating a very insecure place. And so to really just be aware, not only that, there's certain ways of protecting yourself as a business that are really valuable for you and your customers. But a lot of times, again, as a business, if you do lose that data, that really important data for your clients, there's legal repercussions for that. There's fines for that. There's issues for that. So really understanding what is data collection for you as a business? What are you doing with that information? If you're using a third party, what is that third party doing? And how do you make sure that, you're protecting both your company's liability as well as your own customers and taking care of them? So I know there's only a few of us today, so we can wrap up probably early. There are some resources that I pulled for you to look at that kind of inform how I built out the slides to talk about these things. There is a great part of Stanford University called the Institute for Human-Centered AI. And I just shared a recent paper that I thought was really interesting. I'm really loving keeping up with these guys because I feel like they're really having this conversation in a more academic way. And so there's lots of different opinions involved. And they're putting out just lots of content around this. So if you're having conversations, like I said, with your own group, or with your own teams or with your own clients, I just think it's like a great reference point to be able to have a stronger conversation. And I think, again, the last question that I want you to sort of leave thinking about is like, what steps can you actually take, right? And when we go back over these slides, which I'll share with you along with the recording, these are some of those like clear steps we can do right out of the gate, which seem very simple, but taking some time as you're going into 2025 to really evaluate, what are you using? Why are you using it? Are there any levels of, data collection for yourself, for your organization, and also for your customers? And just like really making sure you've built that into some of your planning. I think, we do quarterly meetings here. That's become something that we talk about in our quarterly meetings. We can't really revisit it every week because none of us have time, but it's like we're really working on every quarter having something that we can move forward, whether that's completing our policy about different things, whether it's being transparent about tools that we use and letting our clients know, whether it's saying, you know, we have this concern, and just even bringing that concern up as a team and saying, like, what level of worry do we have about this? And the more that I think you talk about it with other people, the better you get at talking about it. So just so you know, Candace, like, it's okay to be confused. I think everybody's confused. And like, that's why we have to kind of have these conversations and ask these questions. But is there anybody who just wants to share kind of what their steps are? What's one thing they think they can do? And hey, Danielle, we were just wrapping up. But we're just
I
kind of talking about the
figured-
final steps. But I'm going to share the recording and all the slides in the next couple of days. But is there anybody who feels like they've got some clarity around steps they can take or things that just jumped out as like possible action items?
I think the call to action is don't do nothing. So I appreciate Sarah stepping up to the table here and feeding the beast of thoughts that we need to consider and be good stewards of AI.
Thanks, Mark, because I've really built in these conversations partially selfishly because I just need to have them or I feel kind of like freaked out. It's like helpful to ground out and like share with people and kind of just like say, we don't know what we're really talking about at this point yet, but there's a lot of good possibility as much as there's scary stuff. All right, well, thanks for spending your lunch hour with me. Like I said, think about how you can move the dial forward. We'll be having these discussions again for the next few months. I'll definitely send an update on the upcoming dates along with a recording in the slide deck. And all of my contact information is in there as well. So please don't hesitate if you have questions, you need additional resources, you're going to have a conversation with your company, you just want to brainstorm with somebody about how to have that conversation. I'm always willing to grab a virtual coffee and talk it out. Because we're doing this across the board with so many of our clients and so many of our students and really trying to be, like Mark said, good stewards while we're in this time of really big change. But I really appreciate everybody taking the time today. Thanks so much.